Well, let's talk about the plan for a cross-Canada consultation on systemic racism with three members of Parliament. From the foyer this evening, I'm joined by Greg Fergus, Liberal MP for Hull-Aylmer. That's in the province of Quebec, of course. David Anderson's a Saskatchewan MP and the critic for human rights and religious freedoms for the official opposition Conservatives. And Jenny Kwan is a British Columbia MP and the critic for multiculturalism, immigration, refugees and citizenship for the NDP. Good to see you all. Mr. Fergus, let me start with you. Why does the country need a national consultation on systemic racism?
Well, I think when you start taking a look at the actual situation, you can realize that there is the question of systemic racism that exists in this country. For example, if we were just to take a look at the incarceration rates of people of African descent or of indigenous peoples, you'll see that although both groups represent between 3 and 4% of the general population, their incarceration record or proportion, they represent about, for the black community, about 9%, 3 times their demographic weight, and for the indigenous peoples, it's about 7 to 8 times their demographic weight. We all know that Indigenous peoples or black Canadians are now no more apt to commit a crime than anybody else. So you're left with an uncomfortable conclusion that there is some discrimination, systemic discrimination that's going on.
And so what will happen from I guess a couple of things before I move to your colleagues. What form will that consultation take? Has the government decided yet? Is it a parliamentary committee traveling across the country or something else? What's the objective? What do you do after you've done the consultation? What's the objective here?
Well, it's not going to be a traditional consultation in the normal sense of the word where you go out and ask people what to do. This issue has been studied many times by many groups. I think what people are trying to look at is how do we take a look at this historic investment that the government made in the budget to tackle these issues, to take a look at how we can make sure that we create a really inclusive society, and what type of programs, what type of measures that we need to take and to develop to get that ball rolling.
Right. So when you say not traditional, so is it going to be like asking people to submit ideas online, or?
I think it's going to be one of those things where we're going to be looking at and working with different groups that have been in the field for so many years already, trying to address these issues.
All right, Mr. Anderson, what are your thoughts on this process, and do you think the country needs this national consultation on systemic racism?
Well, I think, Peter, the Liberals keep painting themselves into the corner on these issues. We saw with M103, they came with a focus on Islamophobia. We asked to broaden the mandate of that motion. They refused to do that, so the public reacted to that. When we came back in the fall to have the hearings, it was clear that the Liberals wanted nothing to do with the word Islamophobia. They had put the word systemic racism and discrimination in their motion, and so they focused on that. They brought in their witnesses to focus on that issue. We didn't get a clear message at the committee. We heard lots of witnesses on both sides of virtually every issue. We heard people say there's systemic racism in virtually every institution and function in the country. We heard other people say, look, if there was systemic racism, I'm from an immigrant community, I would never have gotten to the position that I've gotten to in this country.
What's the view of your party? Do you believe that systemic racism exists in this country?
Well, what we heard at the hearings is that there is racism. There's racism and discrimination in this country. The people who were testifying before us did not all agree that there was systemic racism in this country. So we think the Liberals, once again, they got to the end of the hearings, had got themselves boxed in. They brought a recommendation forward that they needed to have these hearings, and now they're going ahead with them.
Well, what they're planning to do is develop a strategy to fight systemic racism in Canada, and this is part of the way to get there. So I guess what I need to know from you is, do you believe this is a worthwhile exercise to get to an end that you believe is legitimate, that we need a strategy to deal with systemic racism in Canada?
Well, as we heard from my Liberal colleague, this has been studied to death. We did make a proposal in one of our recommendations, which was consistent with our witnesses, which was they wanted, rather than a whole-of-government approach, they suggested a whole-of-Canada approach. And in terms of bringing people together, they thought the faith communities, the ethnic communities could be better served if the government would bring them together and have some discussions about how these issues might be dealt with. And I guess I find it a bit ironic that we're sitting here with the Canada Summer Jobs program where the Liberals have deliberately discriminated against a group of Canadians that don't agree with their public policy, and then they come and say we're going to study discrimination across Canada. So it's inconsistent.
Jenny Kwan, do you believe systemic racism exists in this country, and is this a good way to try and develop a strategy to fight it, a cross-country consultation?
Well, absolutely. Systemic racism exists in Canada. We don't have to look any further than to really see the situation that's going on with the First Peoples, the Indigenous Indigenous community and what they're going through. Having said that, this is actually, I think, an important issue. Throughout the study of M103, many people who came before us talked about the need for action. And what I was hoping the government will do was actually introduce in the budget a national action plan to address racial discrimination and all forms of discrimination. But now they've come in with a consultation process instead. So I'm a little bit worried about the consultation process given the Liberals' history. They have done consultation with electoral reform. Lots of work's been done on that, only for the Prime Minister to make a unilateral decision and to ignore all the advice that were given to him by Canadians. So I'm a little bit worried about that. With that being said, though, I am hopeful that coming out of this process, that it will be a tight process, that it will be a time-limited process, and that we will actually devise an action plan coming out of this that is measurable, accountable, and with a timeline so that we know what kind of action will be taken to address the issue of systemic discrimination and, in fact, all forms of religious discrimination as well.
Here's what came out of the committee. The Carriage Committee looked at this and proposed this and said this: systemic racism occurs when government actions fail to address the needs of certain racialized groups within the population, resulting in unfair discriminatory practices and outcomes. To expose and prevent systemic racism, a number of witnesses suggested the development of a race equity lens as a key element of a national action plan. What would that mean, Mr. Fergus?
That would mean that we would take a look at whatever policies that we're proposing and ask ourselves, are there differential, or will there be differential outcomes to the policies that we're proposing? As I pointed out, for example, in the incarceration rates, you have seen that there's a differential outcome, although you would speak to individuals and no one would ever say that they are actually actively discriminating against different racialized groups, but the numbers speak for themselves. This is that kind of a lens that you have to propose. So when we're taking a look at issues about economic development, we're taking a look at issues of education policy, or health policy, for example, you have to start taking a look at, well, are there differential outcomes? And then how do you measure, how do you propose made-to-measure programs to address that so that everybody can be living freely and in an inclusive society?
Right. Mr. Anderson, what do you think of that? It's in many ways, that sounds like the same kind of approach the government's taken on gender equity and gender equality and making sure that policies they propose, looking at the impacts of policies they propose in particular on women, and now we're looking, and now the government's proposing to look at this from a racial lens. Do you have a problem with that?
Well, I don't think Canadians have a problem with taking a look at government policies, how they impact people. But the declaration in our committee of systemic racism basically implied that there's racism in every institution, every function and structure of Canadian society. And our witnesses did not agree with that. There were some who said, yeah, this is Canadian society, and there were many others who said that's not the case. And I think if we're going to be studying discrimination as well, we need to take in that element of religious discrimination and discrimination against faith groups as well, because we continue to face problems in that area as well.
Let me try to pin you down on this if I can, because I know what you're saying, what the witnesses said, but for a parliamentarian, if you're going to go forward and figure out what has to be done on this, where do you stand on this? Do you believe there is systemic racism or not?
Well, I'm not committing to the Liberals' consultation process here. Our witnesses said clearly, some of them said there is systemic racism in this country. There's others said, no, if there was systemic racism, I would never have gotten
so are you telling me you're not
convinced?
So. You're not convinced that there is systemic racism?
I'm not convinced that the whole process that the Liberals are engaged in here has any credibility. They haven't indicated that right from the beginning of Motion 103, and I'm not sure that this is going to have that credibility at all. And hopefully their process turns out better than the one in Quebec did when the Quebec government initiated similar activity.
All right, Jenny Kwan, I guess you've raised some concerns about the notion of credibility in the process. You want to know what comes next. Are you convinced that the problem that you believe needs to be addressed will get addressed by, at least in part, this process?
Well, I think this is the beginning of the process. If we have a time-limited consultation process, and then coming out of that process, we actually devise an action plan to address the issue of systemic racism and all forms of religious discrimination, then we have something to go forward with. But with that plan, it needs to be resourced. The government actually needs to put resources to it. There needs to be measurable outcomes so that we can see what the results are. And then, of course, last but not least, it needs to be open and transparent. I think that all Canadians want to ensure that people are not discriminated against, yet we all know that that is exactly what's happening right now. It's not at every corner, but it is happening. So we need to actually address this issue with a level of seriousness, with the kind of investment, and it's just not talk. Given the Liberal government's history, I am worried about it, but I will be vigilant in working on this process and watching this process and holding the government to account. And I hope that we don't disappoint. I hope the Liberals don't disappoint Canadians, because this is too important. Racism and all forms of discrimination should not be a partisan issue. It is an issue that defines who we are as Canadians, that we are equal before everyone, that we welcome everyone. And if we're going to actually realize those words, then we need to put action to it, and we need an action plan with resources.
I can say one thing, and that
very quickly, please.
Jenny will certainly, I could say, for check mark on all the points that she had raised, that she will be pleased at the end of this process. There will be an action plan, it will be time limited, and there will be results to this. And I hope, as she said, that all Canadians could understand that this is a way for us to come together. It's not a partisan issue. It's not one for division. Everybody wants to build an inclusive society. It's the only way forward.
We will follow the process and have more to say about it as it moves along. Thank you all tonight.
Thank you.
Take care.